Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the North Shore Unitarian Church, where our mission is to empower people to live with greater depth, meaning, and purpose. What I love about this community is how the Sunday service provides an anchor for my week and my life. I love everything about it. I love the music. I love the stories. I love singing the children out. I love the inspiring sermons. And I love being surrounded by inspiring people who share my values. So I hope everyone feels welcome here today, no matter how you make your living, who you love, where you come from, what your sacred is, or any other differences that make us stronger. Again, I hope you feel welcome here.
I'd like to add another welcome, especially to those who are visiting us today. My name is Ariel, and I'm the Youth Program and Connections Coordinator. If you'd like to learn more about our community, we invite you to sign in on the iPad, which is in the foyer, or fill out a visitor information card from the pew in front of you and drop it in the offering basket. Those wearing greeter buttons are especially available to answer any questions that you might have. And all are invited to come downstairs after to have some coffee after the service and engage in some conversation down there. Our class for newcomers, Starting Point, will be beginning soon. And if you'd like to sign up for that, please talk to me or Reverend Emily.
We kindle this flame as a symbol of our gathering.
May the light of understanding illuminate our darkness. May the warmth of sharing bring us peace.
Thank you. Some of you know that I was born and raised in Montreal. Back in the day, Montreal was very much a divided city with the French on one side and the English on the other. But I want to tell you it was amazing growing up with two religions, two cultures, and two languages. The religions, of course, were two aspects of Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism. I lived on Old Orchard Avenue in Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, which was, of course, NDG to the Anglophones. At the bottom of my street was a very large Catholic church, St. Augustine's. I had a lot of friends who went to that church, and I know that their experience was very different from mine in Dominion Douglas United Church in Westmount. I was fascinated by that church. I wanted very much to know what on earth happened there. I had peeked in once, saw the darkness, smelt the incense, saw the clergy moving about. I didn't want to become a Catholic, I just wanted to know. So I asked some of my friends, who of course went to confession on a weekday, if I could go with them and see this church, and they said sure. So they had their scarves, I had no hat, which of course was required in those days. So I gathered a bunch of large leaves and needs must. So off we all went. They with their scarves, me with my leaves. But once inside, the darkness was dispelled by hundreds of candles. The light from the candles glinted off gold, statues, windows, and there was a kind of deep silence and a scented warmth. I'll never forget the glowing of that beautiful church. And that's one reason I think that we're all together here today, to see if we can feel the warmth of community and if we can touch that deep stillness that holds us all together.
The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron tells a story about the spiritual teacher Gurdjieff. You know him? He was this mystic, first half of the 20th century, Greek-Armenian descent, kind of traveled all over Europe. The story goes like this. At one point, Gurdjieff was living in a spiritual community in France. He had gathered people together for this community of practice, and there were about 35 of them there. And there was one person in that group of 35 who was just challenging. Not one of the other people in the community liked this guy. He was irritable and, he just grouchy, disgruntled, mean-tempered. You can imagine the kind of person this was. And now Gurdjieff was said to have students do meaningless tasks as a way of testing their kind of spiritual fortitude, how much they could endure. So one day in this story, the students are put to moving a lawn from one side of the road to the other. As there they are, bit by bit, cutting out little sods of grass and bringing them over. And finally, this one guy, he's had enough, and he takes his sod of grass and throws it down and says, "That's it. This is stupid. I'm not taking another minute of it." And he storms off to his car and drives away. And everybody cheers. Well, praise be. But when Gurdjieff learned that this had happened, he got right in his car, drove after him, and somehow convinced him to come back. And later on, Gurdjieff's assistant was meeting with him, taking care of something, this young man in the community, and said, I just have to ask, why did you bring him back? And he turns to him and he says, well, this is a secret between you and me, but I pay that man to be here. What is an enemy? Do you have any enemies? Or perhaps enemy is too strong a word. Many of us strive to live without enemies, but what about that coworker or that sibling or friend of a friend who just gets on your nerves? You know what I'm talking about, right? Someone who can ruin a meal for you just by sitting across and talking in the way that they talk. There's a trope about Thanksgiving in the United States, and I have to check if it's true here too, that everyone has to kind of gird themselves for the conversation that they're going to have over the long meal with extended family with whom they may have vehement disagreement about politics or religion, values. Maybe just really annoy them. People write all sorts of advice columns in the week leading up to Thanksgiving. How to deal with these conversations. Was that a dynamic here? You seem to know what I'm talking about, at least. The essence of the story is that visiting with family, for some, is a trip into enemy territory. That we must prepare ourselves for the battle to come. And now I hope that Thanksgiving does not feel like going into battle for any of you. But from everything I know about families, I'd be surprised if for at least a few it didn't. And so the trouble is this: how do we practice gratitude, the ostensible purpose of the day when we're preparing to confront an enemy? And if it doesn't come up at Thanksgiving for you, great. Call to mind some occasion when you are faced with this challenge. There is a wisdom that is articulated in such a strikingly similar way by so many of the great spiritual teachers of history that I can't help but think it's one of those essential truths about life and the spiritual journey. Gautama Buddha is quoted, "Your worst enemy is your best teacher." Jesus of Nazareth said, "But to you who hear I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you." The prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught it like this: good deed and evil deed are not equal. Requite evil with good. Requite evil, respond to evil with good, and he who is your enemy will become your dearest friend. So I think it's normal and natural to have enemies or enemy images, as it's talked about in one of my practices. We might ascribe enemy images to people or to groups or organizations or even people or ideas. It happens at the micro level of our personal relations, the little enemies of our daily lives. The family member I disagree with, the stubborn bureaucrat in my way, simply the stranger on the street, or especially in the car behind me who's having a bad day and decides to take it out on me. And sometimes when I'm feeling hostile towards someone or something, I think of that logo. You've probably seen it on a bumper sticker or on a t-shirt. No enemy, the bird soaring over a pair of fists. I think what a beautiful and succinct articulation, no enemy. What a concise and sacred goal, easy to remember, a clarion call to my highest aspirations. And in the moment when that someone has just cut me off in traffic at the end of a long day, what an annoying piece of inane, hippie drivel. I could happily live with no enemy if there weren't any idiots around. I could happily live with no enemy if there weren't powerful leaders in public and private spheres hell-bent on putting profits before people and planet. And I could happily live with no enemy if our law enforcement and justice systems, our child welfare, and our safety net were free of racist practices and outcomes. I could. So given that there are fights worth fighting for, that there is work to be done and justice to be made, injustice to overcome, I must ask, how do I disagree with someone without making them my enemy? How can I look at my enemies, big political enemies or small personal enemies, and remember that they can be, maybe must be, my teachers? How do I remember that anything I hate outside of me has its reflection within me? Because the truth is, while I could live with no enemy happily if there were no idiots, I too am somebody's idiot. I am. In junior high, there was a classmate of mine. He was a constant thorn in my side. I'll call him James. It wasn't that he put a lot of energy, I don't think, into bullying me, but it was just daily. He'd trip me in the hall or have just the right insult to get the other kids laughing at me. I was a sensitive kid. I felt different for having two moms. The homophobic slurs were a daily given at my school. And I was fat, so there was always that to make me an easy target. And so one day, I decided I'd had enough of this bullying from James. I screwed up what I thought was my courage and was ready to stand up for myself and dish it right back the next time James bullied me. And sure enough, he was standing right behind me in PE class, and he let loose with his daily jibe, and I have no idea what it was, but I remember that I retorted with perfect timing, turning the joke back on yo mama. Now, if yo mama wasn't a thing when you were in school, it was, at least for a time, the schoolyard equivalent of going nuclear. This is the biggest comeback there was. Suffice to say, James shoved me to the ground. The teacher benched us both, and following week in the vice principal's office, I was sternly informed that mothers were off limits. There's still something amusing to me about the picked-on kid with two moms getting in trouble for making a "your mom" joke, but that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, while I thought I was gathering my courage to stand up to an enemy, that day I wasn't courageous at all. I felt small and scared and trapped, like I had no other choice. I had grown up with that book about the secret of the peaceful warrior, but I still didn't know how to stand up for myself without trying to put my enemy down. As a teenager and adult, I worked as an educator with an anti-bullying project. And at one point, we realized that even calling someone a bully was counterproductive to our work, because bully is just another label that can get in the way of understanding the humanity of the person doing the bully. Keeps that enemy image front and center, blocking the curiosity and compassion that are needed to transform the situation. One of the names for this transformation of curiosity and compassion, is the spiritual practice of nonviolence. My understanding is that when Mohandas Gandhi first arrived as a young lawyer in South Africa, he knew nothing about nonviolence. And further, he was not particularly interested in the political realm at all. It was his repeated experiences of being bullied, kicked off trains and kicked in the street, called names and spit upon. These experiences of discrimination politicized him. But even then, it took years and years for him to develop the consciousness that made him our worldwide icon of nonviolence. There are many accounts that in his initial political efforts in South Africa, he was steeped in the very racism that he would eventually set his life against. In defense of Indians in South Africa, he once prepared a legal brief in which he argued, Anglo-Saxons and Indians are sprung from the same Aryan stock, or rather the Indo-European peoples, and that therefore Indians should not be grouped with black Africans. He's quoted in other places using the same epithets against blacks as the white colonists did. But years of firsthand experience of the brutality of oppression, coupled with a devotion to his spiritual path, transformed the young lawyer into the great teacher we know. There's a scene that sums it up, and it's fictionalized, I know, but it's from that early 80s movie, Gandhi. I'm sure many of you have seen it. Gandhi, played by Ben Kingsley, is walking down the street with Charlie Andrews, a priest who became an important ally of Gandhi's. He's played by Ian Charleson. And they're walking down the street, and they're stopped by a trio of young white men. The men call out, "Hey, look who's coming, a white shepherd leading a brown Sammy." The white priest hesitates, suggesting that they might turn around and take a different street. And Gandhi responds, "Doesn't the New Testament say if your enemy strikes you on your right cheek, offer him the left?" The priest protests, "Yes, I think that was meant to be metaphorical." I don't think that, and Gandhi says, "I'm not so sure. I've thought about it a great deal. I suspect he meant you must show courage. Be willing to take a blow, several blows, to show you will not strike back, nor will you be turned aside. And when you do that, it calls on something in human nature, something that makes his hatred for you decrease and his respect for you increase. I think Christ grasped that, and I've seen it work." And he turns to the three men who they have now reached. He smiles brightly and says, "Good morning." One of the the biggest bullies, the biggest enemy images that I have today is the American empire and its leader. And I just need to take the moment to thank the choir for that song, because it is a reminder into the heart of this American empire, a heart that leads me back to curiosity and compassion for all beings. Last year, Patricia Greensteed, a newer member of our congregation, she shared a book with me by local Vancouver author James Hogan. It's titled, I'm Right and You're Wrong. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Right and You're an Idiot. Much better. The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. I'm right and you're an idiot. The toxic state of public discourse. In one chapter, Hogan talks about the influence of Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh. He describes a retreat he attended with Thich Nhat Hanh, and during the retreat, he writes, lectures invariably touched on the subject of anger. And I listened as he encouraged me to examine the anger I felt towards special interests that misled the public about the environmental challenges that we face. One day, Thich Nhat Hanh told us Buddha's story of the second arrow. When an arrow strikes you, there is pain. But if a second arrow drives into the same spot, the pain is excruciating, much worse. The Buddha advised that when you have pain in your body or mind, breathe in and out and recognize the significance of this pain, but don't exaggerate its importance. If you're full of anger, worry, and fear over the pain, you magnify the suffering. This is the second arrow, and it's directed from within. Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching to these passionate activists, Hogan continues, people who care deeply about making the world a better place, about standing up to bullies and the policies that enable bullying. His teaching was perhaps summed up in one line, redirecting their work from the external to the internal. There is suffering, fear, and anger inside of us. And when we take care of it, we are taking care of the world. Later, Hogan had an opportunity to facilitate a conversation between the Buddhist teacher and also David Suzuki and Vancouver's Mayor Gregor Robertson. I was at UBC. And throughout the conversation, Thich Nhat Hanh gently but insistently challenged the traditional thinking of politics and activism with his absolute commitment to mindfulness and compassion. At the end of our interview, Hogan said, I was worried that Thich Nhat Hanh had been saying that we should simply withdraw and meditate. So I mentioned that one of his monks had told me his Bae Na monastery in the central highlands of Vietnam had placed pictures on its website of bad police who were abusing monks and nuns. I pointed out that this seemed like the strategy of activists. Was he saying we should not be activists? He looked at me in a quiet, piercing way that stopped my breath and said slowly, speak the truth, but not to punish. It took me some time, Hogan says, to realize that I'd been given a Zen koan by one of the most important Zen masters of our generation. Thich Nhat Hanh's koan brought me back to his advice to hold our anger with an energy of mindfulness, like the sun shining upon a flower, penetrating deeply until the petals open. Anger can give us the mettle to speak with courage and conviction, but also the venom that blinds us to the views of others. So may we be a people who speak the truth, but not to punish. How do we do so? when the world presents us with everyday little enemies and great enemies in the form of world leaders who hold values so contrary to our own, well, I invite you to try this practice. Next time someone seems like your enemy, imagine for a moment that they were cast by some wise, eccentric spiritual teacher to be just that. What if they were a skillful, paid actor showing up at just the right moment to provide a custom-tailored growth opportunity for you? An AFGO, we sometimes call them, another effing growth opportunity. Imagine it and open that door to curiosity. Invite compassion through for your enemy and for the reflection within you, the true source of your pain and discomfort. Experiment and see if you can even stretch to practice gratitude for that enemy of yours. The poet Rainier Maria Rilke once shared in his letters to a young poet, perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is in its deepest essence something helpless that wants our love. Perhaps everything that frightens us is in its deepest essence something helpless that wants our love. May we be so grateful for our enemies that they transform us, and we them, so that we are both revealed the path to deeper living and deeper loving. May it be so. Amen.